Dylan leaned back in his office chair, rubbing his temples as he stared at his computer screen. The day had dragged on, and his mind was heavy with the weight of endless deadlines. He had been pushing himself hard at work for the past few months, taking on more responsibilities than ever before. The late nights, the constant pressure, and the long hours at the office had drained him, but it was all for a good cause. He was building a future for himself and for Camila. That thought alone kept him going. The last few weeks had been tense between him and Camila, though. Their conversations felt forced, and there was an unspoken distance that hadn't been there before. He couldn't quite put his finger on what had changed, but something had shifted in their marriage. Despite the unease, Dylan believed that they could work through it. They had been through rough patches before. Every marriage had its ups and downs, right? As he was about to shut down his computer for the day, his phone buzzed on his desk. Glancing at the screen, he saw a text from his neighbor, Carter. The message hit him like a punch to the gut. "You better get back home quick. Some guy doing your wife in the pool. It's getting intense." The whole neighborhood can see and hear it. Dylan blinked, his mind refusing to register the words. It had to be a mistake. There was no way this was real. He stared at the message, his heart beating faster with each passing second. "What the hell is this?" he muttered to himself, his voice shaking. He sat there, frozen in place, rereading the message over and over. His hands trembled slightly as a surge of anger, disbelief, and panic welled up inside him. There was no context, no explanation, just a single, damning message. Carter wasn't the type to joke about something like this. He was straightforward, even blunt at times, but never cruel. Dylan's mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. Maybe Carter was mistaken, or maybe it was a sick prank. But then the knot in his stomach told him something else. That growing distance with Camila, the way she'd been avoiding his touch, the coldness in her eyes lately, it all began to add up. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This can't be happening." He grabbed his keys off the desk, his mind in overdrive. With every second that passed, the images flashing in his head grew more vivid. Camila with another man, someone else in their pool, in their home. The thought was unbearable. Dylan bolted out of his office, leaving his computer still running and the lights on. He moved on autopilot, the sound of his heart thudding in his ears drowning out everything else. As he rushed out of the building and into the parking garage, he didn't bother with the usual calm demeanor he always prided himself on. There was no time for that. Not now. He yanked the car door open and slid into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel as if it was the only thing grounding him. His breathing was erratic, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and fury. Camila wouldn't do this. She wouldn't. But the doubt had already taken root, gnawing away at him. Their relationship had been strained. Yes, but infidelity? He couldn't accept it. As he sped out of the garage, tires squealing, he tried to calm himself down, but the panic wouldn't subside. His mind was fixated on one thing, getting home. The drive felt like an eternity, even though it was only 15 minutes. He pressed harder on the gas, ignoring the speed limit, weaving through traffic like a madman. His knuckles were white as they clenched the steering wheel. Come on, Dylan muttered under his breath, as if willing the car to go faster would somehow prevent the unfolding disaster. His phone buzzed again, and he glanced at it briefly, seeing another text from Carter. "Dylan, man, you gotta hurry. People are watching. It's bad." That was it. The last shred of hope he was clinging to crumbled. His vision blurred with rage. People were watching. The neighbors were watching Camila with another man. His fists pounded against the steering wheel in frustration. "Damn it," he shouted. "Damn it, Camila." The moment he turned into his street, he saw them. Neighbors. People standing in small clusters on their front lawns, whispering among themselves. Dylan's stomach twisted as his house came into view. The rumble of the car engine faded as Dylan pulled up to the house, but the noise didn't leave his ears. It was replaced by the pounding of his heartbeat, so loud he could hardly think. His house stood at the end of the cul-de-sac, secluded enough that no one would see anything unless they were looking. And Carter had seen. He left the car door open as he bolted toward the front door, fumbling with his keys in his haste. His hands shook, his breath shallow, caught somewhere between fury and disbelief. As the front door flew open, Dylan heard it, the laughter, faint but unmistakable. His stomach lurched. He couldn't believe this was happening. His feet moved faster, his shoes squeaking against the hardwood as he raced through the house. The sounds became clearer as he neared the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. Heavy breathing, moaning, the splash of water. Dylan's pulse quickened, a sickening rage building in his chest. He paused for a brief second, his hand hovering over the door handle. He didn't want this to be real, but the noise made it impossible to ignore. He yanked the door open. The scene that greeted him made his heart drop. There, in his pool, was his Camila, locked in a passionate embrace with a man Dylan had never seen before. Their bodies glistened under the setting sun, intertwined in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. Dylan felt frozen, unable to move or speak, his hands balling into fists as he stood there, watching the life he had built with Camila crumble before his eyes. The stranger in the pool looked up first. His eyes met Dylan's, and instead of guilt or shock, there was amusement in them. The man smirked, as though proud of what he had done, as if this was some game he had won. Camila didn't notice Dylan right away. She was too lost in her betrayal, her laughter floating through the air, carefree and cruel. But then, as if sensing the tension in the air, she turned. Her smile vanished the moment she saw her husband standing there, her face going pale. "Dylan!" she gasped, scrambling out of the pool. "Dylan, I can explain." She grabbed a towel, wrapping it hastily around herself, as if covering her body would somehow erase what he had just seen. The panic in her voice was unmistakable, but Dylan's eyes remained locked on the man in the pool. He didn't care for Camila's explanations. There was nothing she could say that would fix this. Nothing. The man chuckled, pulling himself up to sit on the edge of the pool, completely unfazed by Dylan's presence. "What's up, buddy?" he said, casually toweling off. "Guess you caught us?" Dylan's jaw tightened, his fist trembling with barely contained rage. "Caught you," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. Camila rushed toward him, desperation in her eyes. "Dylan, please, it's not what it looks like." Not what it looks like." Dylan spat, stepping back from her as though her touch would burn him. "I just caught you screwing this guy in our pool. What the hell is there to explain?" The man laughed again, a slow, mocking sound that made Dylan's blood boil. He stood up, slowly, stretching his arms above his head like this was all a joke to him. "She said she needed a real man to satisfy her," the man said, glancing at Camila with a grin. "Looks like I'm doing a pretty damn good job." Something inside Dylan snapped. Without thinking, he lunged forward, his hand grasping the nearest object, a metal chair from the patio. The red-hot anger in his chest took over. He couldn't hear anything, couldn't think clearly. There was just the overwhelming need to wipe that smirk off the man's face, to make him pay for what he had done. The chair swung through the air, and Dylan didn't care where it landed. He wanted to hurt him, to erase the smug look on his face. The stranger ducked just in time, the chair crashing into the pool with a loud splash. "Dylan, stop!" Camila screamed, trying to pull him back. But Dylan shoved her away, his eyes burning with fury. "You think this is funny?" Dylan yelled, his voice hoarse. "You come into my house, sleep with my wife, and you think you can just laugh it off?" The man held his hands up, but his grin never left his face. "Hey man, it's not personal. She came to me, you know. Maybe you should have done your job at home." Dylan charged at him again, fists flying, but the man sidestepped him easily. The adrenaline pumping through Dylan's veins made him reckless, and the stranger was clearly more athletic, ducking and dodging with ease. "Dylan, please stop," Camila pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. "It's my fault, it's not his." "Shut up, Camila," Dylan roared, turning his fury toward her. "You did this. You destroyed everything. How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me?" Tears filled her eyes as she tried to reach for him, but Dylan recoiled from her touch. "Dylan, I'm sorry. I was lonely. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. But, lonely?" Dylan cut her off, his voice shaking with disbelief. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You've been screwing him behind my back, in our home, and you didn't mean for it to happen?" The man, still smirking, shrugged. "I mean, she wasn't exactly unhappy about it. Maybe you should have seen this coming. That was it." Dylan snapped. He lunged again, this time connecting a punch to the man's jaw. The impact sent the stranger stumbling backward into the pool with a splash. Camila screamed, rushing to the edge of the pool as the man surfaced, shaking water from his face. Dylan, stop it. You're going to hurt him. Good. Dylan spat, standing at the edge of the pool, fists clenched. I want to hurt him. The man wiped blood from his lip, still grinning, though it was tinged with a bit more caution now. You're a psycho, man. No wonder she came to me. Dylan's rage flared again, but this time Camila stepped in front of him, her hands pressed against his chest. Dylan, please just listen to me. I made a mistake, okay? I'm sorry. We can work this out. He stared at her, his heart pounding. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, was standing in front of him, begging for forgiveness. But all he could see was the betrayal. The image of her wrapped around another man in their pool burned into his mind. No, Camila, Dylan said finally, his voice cold. We're done? Her eyes widened in shock, tears spilling down her cheeks. Dylan, no, please don't say that. We can fix this. But he shook his head, stepping away from her. There's nothing to fix. You destroyed it. Dylan stood there, breathing heavily. Camila sobbed quietly beside him, but he didn't look at her. His world had shattered, and there was no going back. The man in the pool dragged himself out, wincing as he stood. I think I'll take off now, he muttered, glancing warily at Dylan. He didn't wait for a response, grabbing his clothes and making a quick exit, but not before throwing one last smirk in Dylan's direction. Chaos exploded in the blink of an eye. The moment Dylan swung the chair again, the man dove beneath the water, narrowly avoiding the metal frame that clattered into the pool. The sound echoed in Dylan's ears, blending with the screams from Camila and the roaring pulse in his head. She rushed at him, trying to grab his arm, her wet hands slipping on his shirt. Dylan, stop, she cried, her voice high-pitched with panic. He reacted without thinking. He shoved her away, more forcefully than he intended. Camila stumbled backward, her feet slipping on the slick patio surface, and fell hard onto the concrete. The sickening thud as her body hit the ground sent a chill through him, but the fury inside him wouldn't let him care. She looked up at him, wide-eyed, a mixture of shock and fear etched across her face. But all Dylan could focus on was the rage, the betrayal, and the man who was still smirking in his pool. The stranger resurfaced, wiping water from his face with a mocking laugh. That all you got, buddy? He taunted, his grin as infuriating as ever. Dylan's body shook with anger, his fists clenched at his sides. The world around him blurred, and all that remained was the sharp sting of betrayal and the need to end this nightmare. He had trusted her, had loved her, and now it felt like a knife was twisting in his chest. Dylan, please, Camila whispered, trying to stand, but she was wincing from the fall, clutching her side. Don't do this. We can talk about this. But Dylan wasn't listening anymore. Her voice was a distant hum, lost in the swirl of emotions crashing inside him. His eyes remained locked on the man in the pool, the one who had taken everything from him. This wasn't just about an affair. It was about the humiliation, the disregard, and the utter destruction of everything he held dear. The safe by the patio door. His emergency gun. It was for protection, for intruders, not for situations like this. But his hand moved on its own, his fingers finding the code, pulling out the Magnum. His vision narrowed, and his grip tightened around the cold steel, the weight of the weapon grounding him in the only way that made sense in this moment. Dylan, stop it. You're not thinking straight. Camila's voice cut through the air, but he couldn't hear her. He couldn't think of anything beyond the sight of this man, this stranger, who had the audacity to laugh at him, as if all of this was some sick game. Yeah, what are you going to do? The man sneered, standing waist-deep in the pool with a cocky grin. He raised his hands in mock surrender, eyes glinting with amusement. You going to shoot me over her? She's not worth it, man. Trust me. That was it. Dylan's finger hovered over the trigger, every fiber of his being telling him to pull it, to end this torment once and for all. The man's words seared into his brain. She's not worth it. Was she? The question lingered for a brief moment. His mind flashed to their wedding day, the vows, the promises of forever. But that was gone now. Before Dylan could make his decision, everything spiraled out of control. In a blur of motion, the man lunged from the pool, his wet arms snatching Camila by the wrist. She screamed, her body twisting as she tried to pull free, but he was stronger. He dragged her into the water, holding her under with a vicious, cold determination that Dylan hadn't seen before. The smug lover was gone. In his place was something darker, more dangerous. Dylan's heart stopped. For the first time, true fear gripped him. He had thought this was about revenge, about punishing the two people who had betrayed him. But now, as he watched Camila struggle, thrashing wildly under the water's surface, it became something much more sinister. "Let her go!" Dylan shouted, his voice breaking through the haze of violence. The man didn't respond. He held Camila under, her frantic movements growing weaker with every passing second. Dylan's mind raced. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. He just wanted to catch them, to end the relationship, to make them pay for the hurt. But now Camila's life was slipping away before his eyes. Dylan's hand tightened on the gun, his vision narrowing into a tunnel. He aimed, his breath shallow and unsteady. He had never shot anyone before, never even imagined he would be in a position like this. But he couldn't let this psychopath kill her. No matter what she had done, she didn't deserve to die. The man glanced up, his eyes locking with Dylan's for a split second. And then, with a twisted grin, he shoved Camila's head against the pool's edge. The crack echoed across the yard. Dylan fired. The shot rang out, a deafening boom that cut through the air. But it was too late. The bullet splashed into the water, missing its target by inches. The man let go of Camila, letting her limp body float in the water, blood streaming from her head. Her arms were motionless, her face pale beneath the surface. "Camila!" Dylan's scream ripped from his throat as he ran toward the pool, his gun clattering to the ground behind him. He dove in, the cold water engulfing him as he grabbed her, pulling her lifeless body to the surface. He held her in his arms, shaking her, trying to get any response. Her head lolled to the side, blood staining her blonde hair, and Dylan's heart sank to a depth he had never known. He laid her on the concrete beside the pool, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse. "Camila," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please," but there was nothing. Dylan's chest heaved, his hands shaking as he pressed down on her chest, desperately trying to revive her. Come on," he shouted, his voice hoarse. He pounded on her chest, his fingers slipping against her wet skin. The man stood there, watching, his expression unreadable now. The cockiness had drained from his face, replaced by something colder. He wiped blood from his mouth, still dripping from where Dylan had struck him earlier. "You should have just let it go," the man said quietly, almost to himself. "You should have just walked away." Dylan stopped, staring down at Camila's motionless form, her lips slightly parted, her eyes closed. This wasn't supposed to happen. He didn't want this. His hands were stained with the blood of his own mistakes, his rage having led to a moment he could never take back. The sound of distant sirens began to echo, growing louder with each passing second. Someone had called the police. Maybe it was the neighbors, maybe it was Carter, but it didn't matter anymore. Everything was over. Dylan cradled Camila's head in his lap, his tears falling onto her pale face, mixing with the water from the pool. His whole world collapsed in that instant. The sirens screamed closer, but all Dylan could hear was the silence in his own heart. The man, sensing the approaching chaos, turned to leave, but before he could make his exit, the piercing wail of sirens cut through the thick night air. Dylan stood by the pool, barely aware of the flashing red and blue lights that bathed his home in a surreal glow. Paramedics rushed to Camila's lifeless form, lying limp on the pool deck, her skin as pale as the concrete beneath her. Time seemed to slow, every second dragging into eternity as Dylan watched them work. "Clear the area," one of the EMTs shouted as they pulled Camila's body onto a stretcher. Dylan tried to step closer, but an officer blocked his path. "Sir, you need to stand back," the cop said firmly, guiding Dylan away from the scene. His words didn't fully register. All Dylan could do was stare, his gaze fixed on Camila's still body, blood mingling with the water from the pool, her wet hair matted to her head. Her face looked so peaceful, like she was merely sleeping, except for the deep wound on her head. A hand on Dylan's shoulder startled him back to the moment. Another officer, this one older and gruff, stood in front of him, notepad in hand. "Sir, can you tell us what happened here?" Dylan opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He looked around, trying to gather his thoughts. The chaos around him, paramedics rushing Camilo into the ambulance, police securing the area, neighbors standing on their lawns watching the scene unfold, felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. I came home and Dylan's voice cracked. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to continue. "I came home, and there was a man in the pool with her. I tried to stop them, and he attacked her. I tried to stop him." The officer scribbled notes, glancing up occasionally. "And this man, do you know him?" Dylan shook his head. "No, he just showed up. My neighbor called me. I didn't know him." The officer turned and motioned to a group of cops standing around Derek, who was now handcuffed and sitting on the curb, blood still trickling from his lip where Dylan had punched him earlier. Derek's smirk was gone, replaced with a blank, cold stare. His cocky demeanor from earlier had vanished. Now, he was just another criminal waiting to be processed. "We've got him," the officer said, jotting something down. "We'll be charging him with assault and attempted murder." "Is there anything else we should know, sir?" Dylan's mind raced. He wanted to say everything. How this man had destroyed his life. How Camila had betrayed him. How none of this would have happened if he had just come home earlier. But the words stuck in his throat. Nothing he said would change the fact that Camila was in that ambulance, fighting for her life. The officer gave Dylan a nod and turned away, joining his colleagues as they loaded Derek into the back of a police car. For a moment, Dylan watched him go, the clink of handcuffs and the slam of the door punctuating the scene. Derek's eyes met Dylan's through the glass, a twisted smile curling at the corner of his mouth as the car pulled away. Hours later, Dylan found himself in the sterile waiting room of the hospital. The fluorescent lights above buzzed softly, casting a harsh glow on the rows of uncomfortable plastic chairs. Dylan sat slumped in one of them, staring at the tile floor, his hands still trembling. Every so often, he glanced at the double doors leading to the ICU, hoping for some kind of news. His mind refused to settle. Every moment replayed in his head. The laughter he had heard when he arrived home. The sight of Camila entangled with Derek. The look in her eyes when she saw him standing there. He thought about the gun, the way his finger had hovered over the trigger, the split second when everything had gone from bad to worse. If he had pulled the trigger when he had the chance, would Camila still be alive? Or would he have made everything even worse? A nurse walked by, glancing at Dylan with sympathy, but he didn't return the look. His whole world had collapsed, and no amount of sympathetic glances could change that. His mind wandered to what was happening behind those ICU doors. Was Camila still alive? Would she ever wake up? He hadn't been able to go with her in the ambulance. They said she needed immediate care, and he was left in the aftermath of the wreckage. As the hours dragged on, Carter, his neighbor, showed up, the same neighbor who had called him earlier, warning him about what was happening. Carter approached slowly, sitting down beside Dylan without saying a word at first. I didn't know it would end up like this," Carter said quietly, his voice thick with regret. "I thought I was just giving you a heads up. I didn't think." He trailed off, glancing toward the ICU doors. Dylan didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. It wasn't Carter's fault. Not really. Carter had just been the messenger, delivering the news that had already destroyed Dylan's life. But it didn't matter now. The damage was done. "I'm sorry, man," Carter muttered after a long silence. "I really am?" Dylan nodded, his eyes still fixed on the floor. "Thanks," he said, though the word felt hollow. Nothing anyone said could take away the agony that was gnawing at him from the inside out. Just as Carter was about to say something else, the ICU doors swung open, and a doctor stepped out. Dylan stood up immediately, his heart pounding. The doctor, a tired-looking man in his 50s, approached, glancing at the clipboard in his hand before meeting Dylan's eyes. "Mr. Anderson?" the doctor asked. "Yes," Dylan said, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor took a deep breath, his expression grave. Your wife sustained severe head trauma from the impact against the pool. We've stabilized her, but she's in a coma. We won't know the full extent of the damage until if she wakes up. Dylan felt the floor drop out from under him. A coma. The word echoed in his mind, but he couldn't fully grasp it. If she wakes up? Dylan asked, his voice shaking. The doctor gave him a somber look. We're doing everything we can, but we have to be prepared for all outcomes. I'm sorry. Dylan stood there, staring at the doctor as the words sank in. Prepared for all outcomes. His whole life had been flipped upside down in a matter of hours, and now he was being told that there might not be a way back. The doctor gave him a gentle nod before turning and walking back through the double doors. Dylan stood there, frozen, the weight of the night crashing down on him all at once. He sank back into his chair, his mind spinning. Carter placed a hand on his shoulder, offering silent support, but it did nothing to ease the pain. Dylan stared blankly ahead, the doctor's words ringing in his ears. Camila was in a coma. She might never wake up. And what then? Would he be left with nothing but memories of betrayal, anger, and regret? Would this be his life now, waiting in a sterile hospital room, haunted by the choices he had made and the ones he hadn't? For the first time that night, the tears came, silent and unstoppable. They streamed down Dylan's face as he buried his head in his hands, alone with his thoughts, his grief, and the shattering realization that nothing would ever be the same again. The sterile smell of the hospital hung in the air as days blurred into one another. The machines beside Camila's bed beeped steadily, a monotonous reminder that her life was hanging by a thread. Dylan had visited only once since the night she was brought in, standing at the foot of her bed, arms crossed, staring at the woman who had shattered his world. He couldn't look at her without feeling the sting of betrayal. It wasn't just about the affair. It was the deception, the lies, the way she had thrown everything they had shared away for a few moments of pleasure with a stranger. Even lying in that hospital bed, frail and broken, he couldn't muster sympathy for her. Still, his feet brought him back to the hospital each night, as if he were waiting for something. Closure, maybe, or a sense of finality. He wasn't sure. Tonight was no different, and as he sat in the stiff chair by her bedside, the anger within him simmered beneath the surface, always just a breath away from boiling over. Camila lay motionless, tubes snaking from her arms and oxygen flowing through a mask that covered her pale face. Dylan clenched his jaw, thinking back to the pool, to the way she had looked at him, panicked, desperate, but not sorry. Not until now, when it was too late for apologies. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint movement. Camila's eyelids fluttered weakly, her breath hitching as she slowly regained consciousness. Dylan stood up instinctively, his body tense as he watched her stir. Her eyes opened, glassy and full of tears, as if the reality of what had happened hit her all at once. She blinked several times before her gaze found him, and a small sob escaped her lips. "Dylan," she whispered, her voice barely audible through the rasp of her throat. "I'm so sorry." Dylan stared down at her, the weight of her words hanging between them. For a brief moment, something inside him softened, but it was fleeting. The anger returned just as quickly, tightening his chest and making it hard to breathe. He clenched his fists, trying to keep control of himself. "Please forgive me," Camila continued, her voice cracking with emotion. Her hand moved slowly, weakly reaching out toward him, but she couldn't lift it far. Dylan's eyes followed her trembling fingers, but he didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted, and now she lay there, pleading for his forgiveness. But forgiveness wasn't something he had to give. "No, Camila," he said quietly, his voice cold and unwavering. "I can't." The words hung in the air, sharp and final. Camila's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling from her eyes as she tried to comprehend his rejection. Her hand dropped back to the bed, and she looked up at him with a desperation that only deepened the chasm between them. "Dylan, please," she begged, her voice strained. "I made a mistake, a horrible mistake. I wasn't thinking. I was stupid. But I love you. I never stopped loving you." Dylan let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Love? You call this love? He gestured to the machines, the tubes, the bandages that now covered her once flawless skin. You didn't think about me when you were with him. You didn't think about the life we had, the years we spent together. Camila's tears flowed freely now, her body trembling with sobs. I did think about you. Every day. But I felt so lost, Dylan. We were drifting apart, and I was lonely. I thought he could fill that void, but I was wrong. So wrong. Dylan's expression hardened, the rage he had been trying to suppress now bubbling to the surface. You felt lost? He repeated, incredulous. So you slept with some stranger in our pool? You destroyed our marriage because you were lonely? Don't you dare try to twist this into something that just happened. You made a choice, Camila. You chose to betray me. She shook her head frantically, her sobs racking her frail body. It wasn't like that. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did, Dylan snapped, stepping closer to the bed, his voice rising with each word. You didn't just hurt me, you destroyed me. And for what? For him? Some random guy you barely knew. Camila winced at the venom in his voice, but she didn't stop crying. She reached out for him again, her fingers trembling as they hovered in the air between them. Please, Dylan, don't leave me like this. I need you. Dylan's eyes narrowed, and he stepped back, out of her reach. You needed me before. You needed me when you made that choice. But you didn't care then. Why should I care now? I love you, she whispered, her voice barely audible through her sobs. I still love you. We can fix this. Please, Dylan. We can start over. Dylan felt a surge of anger so intense that he could barely keep his voice steady. Start over? How do you expect me to start over after this? How do you expect me to forget what you did? Camila's sobs turned into quiet, pitiful whimpers. She stared up at him, broken and pleading, but Dylan felt no sympathy, only an overwhelming sense of betrayal. The woman he had once loved was gone, replaced by someone he no longer recognized. We had everything, he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. And you threw it away. You threw us away. Camila's face crumpled as his words sank in. She knew there was no coming back from this, no way to undo what she had done. Please, she whispered one last time, her voice barely audible. Don't leave me. But Dylan had already made up his mind. The hurt, the anger, the betrayal, it was all too much. He couldn't forgive her. He couldn't forget. He turned away from her, walking toward the door without another word. Camila's sobs filled the room, but he didn't look back. He couldn't. As he reached the door, he paused for a moment, his hand resting on the cold metal handle. His heart ached, torn between the love he once had for her and the burning resentment that now consumed him. But in the end, the choice was clear. Without a second glance, Dylan walked out of the room, leaving Camila behind with nothing but the echo of her own cries. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time in days, Dylan felt a strange sense of relief. The weight he had been carrying was still there, but now it felt lighter, as if a part of the burden had been lifted. He had made his decision, and there was no going back. The sun glared through the courthouse windows as Dylan sat in silence, waiting for his name to be called. It had been a few weeks since Camila was discharged from the hospital, but those weeks felt like an eternity. He had spent countless hours pacing the house, trying to reconcile with everything that had happened. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that clung to him. The memory of seeing Camila with Derek, of hearing her pleas in the hospital, was still too fresh, too raw. Across the room, Camila sat alone, her eyes red from crying. She glanced at Dylan, hoping to catch his eye, but he kept his gaze fixed on the floor, refusing to acknowledge her. The space between them felt like an insurmountable chasm, and she knew there was no bridge left to cross it. The bailiff called their names. Dylan stood, his body stiff, while Camila hesitated for a moment before following him to the front of the courtroom. The divorce hearing was brief, just a few legal formalities, papers being signed, and it was done. Years of marriage, all the memories, the love, the laughter, reduced to a few strokes of a pen. As the judge handed down the final decree, Camila's heart broke all over again. She had begged Dylan to reconsider, had pleaded with him to give her another chance. But his mind was made up. There was no going back. She had lost him, and the reality of that hit her harder than anything else. Outside the courthouse, Camila hurried to catch up with Dylan as he walked briskly toward the parking lot. "Dylan, wait," she called, her voice trembling with desperation. Dylan stopped, but didn't turn around. His shoulders were tense, and the muscles in his jaw tightened as he stared ahead. "Please," Camila said, coming to a stop beside him. "We don't have to end things like this. We can talk. We can fix it." He slowly turned to face her, his eyes hard, devoid of the warmth they once held. "There's nothing to fix, Camila. You made sure of that." His words were clipped, final. Tears welled up in her eyes. "I made a mistake. A horrible mistake. But we've been through so much together. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" Dylan stared at her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "It did," he said quietly. "But not anymore. You killed whatever was left between us the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you." Camila's face crumpled, and she reached for his arm, but Dylan stepped back, avoiding her touch. "Please don't do this," she whispered. "I love you. I always have." Dylan shook his head, exhaling sharply. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have done what you did. You wouldn't have lied, wouldn't have thrown our marriage away for him." His voice cracked, and for a brief moment, Camila thought she saw a flicker of the man she once knew. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I tried, Camila," he continued, his voice steady again. "I really did, but I can't forgive you for this. And I won't. You need to move on, just like I am." Camila sobbed, her shoulders shaking as she struggled to find the right words. "Dylan, I'm begging you, please. Don't leave me like this." But Dylan's expression remained resolute. "It's too late, Camila. This is the end." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Camila standing there, shattered and alone. She watched him as he disappeared into the crowd, her heart breaking with each step he took. She wanted to run after him, to scream, to do anything that would make him stay. But deep down, she knew it was over. She had lost him for good. Dylan drove home in silence, the weight of finality settling in. The divorce was done. He had walked away from Camila, from everything they had once been, but instead of feeling grief or anger, there was only a strange sense of calm. It was over. He had made his decision, and for the first time in months, he felt like he could breathe again. Over the following weeks, Dylan found himself slowly piecing his life back together. He moved out of the house he and Camila had shared, finding a small, peaceful place in a nearby town. His days became quieter, his nights lonelier, but it was a loneliness he could bear. He didn't miss the arguments, the tension, or the lies. He had spent so much time wrapped up in the bitterness of the past that it felt freeing to finally let it go. One day, while out for coffee, Dylan met Eliana. She was kind, with a warm smile and eyes that seemed to see through the walls he had built around himself. At first, Dylan kept his distance, unsure if he was ready to open himself up to someone new. But Eliana was patient, never pushing him too hard, always giving him space when he needed it. They began spending more time together, quiet dinners, walks in the park, conversations that stretched late into the night. Eliana was everything Camila hadn't been. She was gentle, compassionate, and honest. Slowly, Dylan found himself healing in ways he hadn't thought possible. With Eliana, there were no mind games, no betrayals. Just simple, genuine love. Months turned into a year, and Dylan found himself falling deeply for her. On a cool autumn afternoon, he proposed, and to his joy, she said yes. Their wedding was small, just close friends and family, but it was perfect. For the first time in a long time, Dylan felt truly happy. Meanwhile, Camila's life had taken a different turn. The divorce had left her broken, not just emotionally, but financially as well. The life she had once taken for granted was gone, replaced by a series of dead-end jobs and cheap apartments. Derek, the man she had risked everything for, was long out of the picture, leaving her with nothing but regret and a deep sense of loss. She heard about Dylan's new life through mutual acquaintances. They told her how happy he was, how he had found someone who loved him the way he deserved. Each piece of news felt like a dagger to her heart, a reminder of everything she had thrown away. One day, she spotted Dylan and Eliana together at a local cafe, laughing and holding hands. Camila watched from a distance, her heart heavy with jealousy and sorrow. She had once been in Eliana's place, happy, loved, secure. But now, all she had left was the bitter knowledge that she had destroyed it all with her own hands. As she turned and walked away, Camila knew she would never find peace. The pain of her betrayal would haunt her for the rest of her life, a constant reminder of the man she had lost and the life she had thrown away. Time marched on, but Camila remained stagnant, her life a shadow of what it once was. The echoes of laughter from the happy couples in the park, the bright lights of the restaurants, and the buzzing energy of life outside her window were constant reminders of her past. She felt like a ghost haunting the remnants of a life she had so recklessly discarded. The morning started the same way, waking up in a small, one-bedroom apartment filled with boxes she hadn't unpacked since the divorce. The wallpaper was peeling, and the furniture was mismatched, remnants of thrift store finds. She'd pull herself out of bed, forcing herself to put on a brave face. But the truth was, she was still drowning in regret. One afternoon, she found herself sitting on her worn-out couch, scrolling through social media. She couldn't help but click on Dylan's profile. Pictures of him and Eliana filled the screen, smiling faces, adventures, and love radiating from their eyes. Every post was like a knife twisting in her gut. She remembered the dreams they had shared, the plans they had made, and the life they had envisioned together. "Damn it," she shouted, throwing her phone against the wall. It shattered on impact, but the satisfaction of releasing her frustration was short-lived. She picked up the pieces, feeling the familiar sting of tears threatening to fall. "Why did I do this?" she whispered to herself, anguish pouring from her heart. It was a month after her latest breakdown that she received a letter from Derek. He had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for his actions against her, but he had managed to write to her, his words dripping with bitterness. "Camila, you're as pathetic as I am. We're both prisoners of our own making. I'm rotting in here while he gets to have a life with you gone. If you want revenge, we can do this together. It's not over." She sat in silence, staring at the words. Part of her recoiled in disgust, but another part felt a flicker of excitement. She had spent so long watching Dylan live the life they once planned. Maybe she could take back some power. She grabbed a pen and began to write. "Derek, I'm listening. What do you have in mind?" As she sent the letter, Camila felt a surge of adrenaline. It was the first time in a long while she felt alive, even if it was a dangerous path she was considering. She needed a plan, and Derek seemed to be the only one who could help her. Days turned into weeks as they exchanged letters. Derek suggested ways to undermine Dylan's happiness, to expose him to the world as a fraud. "All you have to do is get close to Eliana, find out what makes her tick, then we can shatter their world together." At first, she hesitated, but the thought of seeing Dylan squirm made her heart race. She recalled the times they had spent together, the way he had looked at her with love and admiration. The bitterness swelled again, and she thought, he deserves to suffer just like I have. It wasn't long before Camila devised a plan. She waited until the weekend when she knew Dylan and Eliana would be at the local farmer's market. It was a small-town event, bustling with vendors and families enjoying the sunshine. She could already picture Dylan walking hand-in-hand with Eliana, the two of them lost in their perfect little world. As she approached the market, she kept her head down, masking her identity with a large sun hat and sunglasses. She spotted them at a fruit stand, laughing as Dylan picked up a juicy peach, pretending to throw it at Eliana, who squealed in delight. "Just act natural," she whispered to herself, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. She maneuvered her way through the crowd until she was within earshot. It was time to put her plan into action. "Hey, could you help me?" she called out to a passing vendor, her voice slightly shaky. She dropped the basket of vegetables, letting them roll toward Dylan and Eliana. "Oops," she exclaimed, putting on her best act. "I'm so clumsy. Can someone help me pick these up?" Dylan turned at the sound of her voice. For a split second, their eyes locked, and a jolt of recognition coursed through him. "Camila?" he asked, surprise etched on his face. "Hey, Dylan," she replied, forcing a smile. "Fancy seeing you here." And Eliana, right? You look great. Eliana smiled, but there was confusion in her eyes. Yeah, I'm Eliana. You're Camila? Yeah, it's been a while. Camila shrugged, keeping her tone light. I just moved back to the area. I thought I'd check out the market. Dylan's expression shifted, a mix of wariness and curiosity. What brings you back? Oh, just trying to start over, she said, her heart racing. I really miss the old days. Eliana stepped forward, concern creasing her brow. Are you doing okay? I heard about what happened to you. Camila feigned a smile. I'm surviving. It's just been tough. Derek? Well, he's still in prison, and I'm just trying to pick up the pieces. Dylan shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to Eliana. Yeah, that must be hard. I know it's awkward running into each other like this, Camila continued, her voice dripping with false warmth. But I'd love to catch up. Maybe grab coffee sometime? Dylan hesitated, glancing at Eliana, who seemed equally taken aback. Maybe we could talk later? Great. I'll get your number. Camila smiled, her heart pounding as she reached for her phone. They exchanged numbers, and she felt a rush of exhilaration. As they parted ways, she could see Dylan's brows furrowed with uncertainty. Her heart raced with the thrill of having rekindled a connection, a bridge to her old life. She walked away, her mind racing with possibilities. The next few weeks were a blur of messages and accidental encounters. Camila played her role well, chatting with Eliana, sharing stories that seemed harmless on the surface but were carefully laced with manipulation. She would mention how Dylan had once loved to take long hikes or how he adored cooking, all while planting seeds of doubt. Are you sure he's really over you? Camila would ask, feigning innocence. He always seemed so happy back then. Eliana would frown, her brows knitting together. I think he is, but sometimes he gets quiet. I wonder if he's thinking about you. Yes, Camila thought, delighting in the seeds of jealousy she was planting. Each time she made Eliana question her relationship, she felt a sense of satisfaction. But there was a dark side to her plan. Derek's letters grew more desperate, urging her to push further. You have to get him to show his true colors. We need to destroy his image. Then he'll realize what he lost. Camila hesitated at times, but the thrill of revenge fueled her. She had made her choices, and now she wanted to see Dylan suffer, just as she had. One evening, she orchestrated a dinner at a local restaurant, making sure to invite both Dylan and Eliana. The tension was palpable as the three of them sat at the table. Camila played the role of the innocent friend, laughing and reminiscing while Eliana's unease grew with every passing moment. Remember the time we went hiking, Dylan? Camila asked, glancing at Eliana. You nearly fell off that cliff because you were too busy taking pictures. Dylan chuckled, but there was a glimmer of discomfort in his eyes. Yeah, I remember. I think I was just trying to get the right angle. Eliana's expression shifted, her smile fading. Really? You were taking pictures? It was just a moment, Eliana, Dylan said quickly. You know how I get when I'm outdoors? Camila leaned in closer, her heart racing as she saw the flicker of doubt cross Eliana's face. But it was such a beautiful view. You couldn't help but want to capture it, right? That's how I remember it. Dylan's demeanor grew tense, and he shifted in his seat. Let's not dwell on the past, okay? We're here to enjoy tonight. Camila noticed the way Eliana's fingers tightened around her glass, the way her smile wavered. The thrill of the game sent adrenaline coursing through her veins. But as the evening progressed, she found herself questioning her motives. Was it worth it? As they finished dinner, Camila felt a pang of guilt creep in. She watched Dylan and Eliana laugh together, a genuine connection that made her heart ache. It was almost as if they had what she and Dylan once shared, a bond she had broken. Hey, let's take a picture, she suggested, trying to maintain her facade. They gathered together, and Dylan draped his arm around Eliana, his smile bright. But when Camila stepped in, she felt an invisible barrier between them. After the flash, she looked at the picture, but all she could see was the happiness that had once belonged to her. The thrill of revenge faded as she stared at their smiles. Later that night, Camila lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The thrill of revenge was fading, replaced by an emptiness that left her restless. She picked up her phone, staring at Dylan's name in her contacts. She thought about the life they had once built and how it had all crumbled to dust. Maybe revenge wasn't the answer. In that moment, she realized the truth. The more she tried to bring Dylan down, the more she was hurting herself. She had to let go to move on. As dawn broke, Camila sat up, feeling a renewed sense of determination. She picked up her pen and wrote one final letter to Derek. I can't do this anymore. I need to focus on myself. I wish you well, but I'm done with revenge. It's time for me to heal. It felt liberating to set that boundary. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she had to stop letting her past dictate her present. She had made her mistakes, but she could still forge a new path, one that led away from bitterness and revenge. Camila took a deep breath, feeling lighter as she sealed the letter. Maybe one day she would find happiness again, but for now, it was time to start anew.